Is Dr. Sarah Reed. I work at Rogers Behavioral Health in the great state of Wisconsin. One of our core programs called Up to Me is related to strategic disclosure, how we share our lived experiences and our challenges in a way that's authentic, in a way that helps us meet our needs and our goals, and in a way that's safe. So I'm here today with Jake Melton, who is a professional speaker and coach living well with Tourette's. And during our time together, we hope to share with you some considerations that we urge you to think about when you are making choices related to sharing your lived experiences with Tourette and associated tic syndromes. Jake?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about my story. So I was 16 years old when I was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. At the time, I would say I was very popular in high school. I was involved in a lot of activities. I had a girlfriend. I had a lot of friends. So I remember sitting in the neurologist's office and getting diagnosed. My parents were on the side of me, and all that I could think about at that time was, if anybody finds out that I have something wrong with me like this, I'm going to lose my friends, my girlfriend's going to dump me, I'm never going to be able to succeed in school, I'm never going to have the career that I want, I'm going to get kicked off the basketball team, kicked out of drama, whatever. Those were as I was sitting there, those were my concerns. And so I didn't tell anybody about it. I told obviously my parents and my siblings, but I didn't even want my grandparents or my close extended family to know. I didn't even tell my best friends about it. And the hard part was it was also visible that even with that being the case, I didn't want to tell them I had Tourette syndrome. There was something about that scared me. So as I went on through life, I still kept that disclosed. I didn't tell anybody about it. And it wasn't until I was dating a girl very seriously and we realized we wanted to get married that I was like, well, I should probably tell her because she's marrying me and I don't want this to be something that if she finds out later I had Tourette syndrome, she's like, wow, you're messed up or something's wrong with you. I should, So I told her, and obviously she loved me for who I was and it wasn't an issue. We ended up having kids, and when I realized that I had a wife that loved me and kids that loved me, that it wasn't so much about the fear of what other people thought anymore because I was okay. So I started a blog, I started going out on social media, and I finally shared with everybody that I had Tourette syndrome. And the reason I did that was because I realized my experience in having this was an opportunity for me to help other people who have it too, and to bring awareness and advocacy to this. It wasn't so much about me anymore, it was about how can I be there for other people. And the moment I changed that mindset and focused on others and how my experience could help them, it made it so much easier for me to disclose it. And I've never been scared or afraid to share it with anybody anymore. So that's been my personal experience.
So it sounds like you've really experienced the gamut or the spectrum of disclosure, as we like to refer to it. Initially, you were very socially avoidant. You didn't want anyone to know. You were fearful of stigma and reactions. Later on, you were more selective. I need to tell this one person because of this very specific reason. So you were thoughtful as to, here is what I hope to get out of this conversation. And I feel safe sharing with my potential spouse because of your experiences with her, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And then later on, become an advocate. So you broadcast your experience in the hope of helping others. We think it's incredibly important to think through those pros and cons related to sharing your experience because you hope to get the support and help that you want and that you need. But reality is that there are some schmucky people out there, and you don't know the vulnerability that you face when you're opening yourself up to responses from other people. So what are some of those other pros and cons that you've weighed in terms of making a choice in telling someone about living with Tourette?
Yeah, I think the biggest fear, so would be a con, is what other people would think of me. For me, one of the big things was, especially when I didn't have my own business at the time, but if my employer finds out about this, am I going to get fired? Am I going to lose my job? Same thing with the friends and family. Maybe they may think I'm weird or something is really wrong with me. They're not going to want to talk to me. They're not going to want to be out with me in public anymore. Those were some of the biggest cons was what other people would think. The pros was, obviously for me personally, hey, I can let other people out there know that they're not alone, and I can start promoting what I'm going through so that maybe we can have more research and support and all of this around it. I'm trying to think of some other, I would say for the biggest pros and cons, it would be those. Definitely.
And that is commonly what I hear from other young people in particular. I also often hear, as a pro, it's a way I can be authentic and genuine and bring my full self into relationships. They call it being 100, I think. So that's another common pro. Also, I can get help for myself. So maybe I need some sort of accommodation or support, or even just emotional support. It's a very common pro that I hear. In terms of other drawbacks, potentially, you nailed it. I mean, I think dealing with the stigma or the potential reactions from people is the main concern that tends to arise. But then how do we weigh all that in terms of taking the best care of ourselves? And so we know in the field of stigma reduction, the chief way in which to reduce stigma is to share our lived experience, is to meet someone who debunks all the myths and misconceptions that exist out there. And yet that is hard for people to do as you've done, and to come out and to be honest and to share their experience with others because of that stigma that exists.
Yeah.
And so really want to emphasize when making disclosure choices, what's best for you in this particular context, and what is right for you in your employment setting, and not be the same thing that is right in terms of talking with your potential partner or your spouse or what have you. You can make one decision in one setting and a completely different one in another setting.
Absolutely.
I would urge. What about social media? So we're on Facebook Live. I think that brings with it some really unique pros and cons and considerations. What's been your experience with sharing your experience online?
So I think the biggest pro to it is you have the biggest reach on social media, right? You can reach the most people, whether it's YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, all of that. But again, because with that being the case, it's also the biggest con of you have more people than ever seeing you and hearing what you're going through, and you have potentially the most judgment that you can have anywhere else. But I think viewing that pro over the con and realizing that, wow, this is a good platform for me to be able to share what I'm going through, for other people to see that they're not alone. Mm-hmm. That's when you have that in mind, it makes it a lot easier to share that on social media. There are always going to be those trolls out there, or like schmucks or whatever you said. There's going to be people out there who like to cause problems, but you're going to receive an amazing support. So I had a video in particular that had hundreds of thousands of views, thousands of comments, and it wasn't about that. What amazed me about it was I didn't have one negative comment out of those thousands of comments. And every post I do, I get at least one negative comment. But on that, I didn't have any negative comments. And it was just amazing to actually see how many people out there are really open to what we're going through, whether it's Tourette or any other sort of mental health illness or challenge.
Sure.
So people are supportive out there, and if you can gain the courage to do that, you'll get that support.
That's great. And I want to emphasize that point, particularly if there's any parents or caretakers watching. There is some value at times to sharing one story online. When I have the social media conversation with adults, there tends to be a lot of resistance to having their child do so. And yet when I have the same conversation with young people, especially young people with Tourette or something else, some other challenge that's relatively rare, the reaction is, that may be the only way I can connect with people like me. Yeah. That may be the only way I feel less isolated. Or perhaps it's 2 a.m. and there's no one else available. That's your only way of reaching out for help. So there's absolutely pros and cons to sharing online via Facebook or any other online forum. Ultimately, it's what is my reason? If my reason for sharing is to reach a lot of people, amazing medium in which to do so. If my reason for sharing is I want to get a lot of likes because I need some sort of validation, may not be the best reason for doing so, because you can experience those trolls as well.
Mm-hmm. That's
so a good point. I think the number one consideration in terms of sharing one story is, what is my reason? Because ultimately that then tells you, who do I tell? How much do I tell? Where do I create boundaries around what I tell? And when do I do so? So if you use your reason as your guide in terms of sharing your story, a lot of other pieces of the puzzle will fall into place.
I love that.
Good.
I agree. And I think to add to that, with the reason is the timing too, right? Absolutely. So for me at 16, if my future self, where I am now, would have said to my 16-year-old self, Jake, you should share this, I never would have done that. So it took timing and the right experiences for me to be able to actually do that. And I think for anybody out there, there's going to be the right time, and if it's not the right time now, there's nothing wrong with that, and that's okay, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it sounds like you have had some negative responses, some schmucky responses, as well as some really affirming and validating ones. How did you use those experiences going forward to try to identify people you felt safe and comfortable telling?
Wow, that's a good question. For me, in when those negative comments came in, I try to just tell myself, these people probably just don't really understand what's happening, and a lot of times it's that they're not aware of what it actually is. They have prejudgments. But for me, in looking at those encouraging comments and stuff, it's just trying to surround myself with those people again. And sometimes when you post something, you never know what you're going to get back. But when you read through comments or you're engaging with people, you can see who those people are that support you, and then just trying to connect with them and getting to know them more. And then the more you post and the more you share and disclose, the more they'll show up and keep supporting you. So you kind of have that tribe behind you that follow you and lift you up when you need.
Oh, I love that term, that tribe, that community of support, those accountability partners. Yeah. Just a great perspective. I also think in terms of looking at someone, what you know about them, regardless of your experience with Tourette. Do you know that they're an affirming person, that they are supportive, that they're a good listener, that you have some sort of existing relationship with them? They tend to be empathetic. Seems to be some personality traits more associated with someone that you hope can be safe and supportive for you to disclose to. But there are sometimes those unintentionally schmucky responses that can be hurtful. I like to believe that the majority of people are well-intended.
Right.
But when you're telling them something new about yourself, they can have a knee-jerk response that can be hurtful. Maybe you're trying to tell your grandma, and that's just out of the realm of her experience and thoughts related to reality, that you would be having Tourette or some other sort of challenge that you're disclosing to her. And maybe grandma says something that takes you aback, that's surprising, and lets you down. If that's the case, how do you repair that conversation with grandma? How do you try to salvage that relationship and conversation so you can ultimately have your needs met?
Wow. In my opinion, this is just my opinion, just explaining and letting them see what life is like with somebody who's going through this. If anybody were to come to this training we have today and walked in the room, they would be amazed at what they can see about Tourette syndrome in general by looking at the people who are here, and learn a lot by just watching. So I think if it were your grandma or if it were somebody else who may not necessarily understand the concept or what it is or not as familiar with, and it really is just that educational part on this is what's happening, can't do anything about it, but I really would love your support because you're my grandma or you're whoever. So yeah, I think it's just the educational piece that could really help.
Yeah, that can go a long way, as can some patience. Ultimately, it takes us a while to accept parts of ourselves, and it might take our loved ones a little bit of time as well. So allowing them that same processing time is a really smart response, and is very needed at times. And sometimes you just need to walk away from a conversation and try it again later at another time, so to speak. I ultimately think focusing on a reason can be really impactful too. So if you're having a conversation with grandma or someone else and you feel like it's going downhill, maintain your talking points. I'm only coming to you for support. I only need accommodations. I'm only sharing this with you because I need extra time on my test or something to that effect, so that you don't go down a rabbit hole. Because ultimately, our natural inclination when we're faced with somebody who's schmucky is fight, flight, or freeze. And so to combat that, if you stay on point, that can be helpful, as can reminding people you thought better. Oh my gosh, Grandma, I was hoping for a more supportive response. Grandma, you're such a kind, loving person. I was really hoping you'd be more understanding. Like, calling out people's good nature, I think, can go a long ways.
Mm-hmm. And to add to that, if your parents are there or your siblings, having them with you too. So, grandma's not really going to argue when you have 5 people around, or whoever it is isn't necessarily going to react the same, maybe if you're alone, as opposed to having other supporters around you. Maybe that's something else. Yeah, and I think what's awesome with I wanted to add this is, if you get any negative stuff, especially on social media, you have a block button, so you can block whoever's. You have a power to keep people off of ever talking to you again. So if you ever get in that situation, you can really surround yourself by positivity by just blocking those people who are causing the negativity in your life.
Certainly.
Yeah.
I think another thing I'd urge you to consider, a number of people, at least those close to you, their responses, if hurtful or schmucky, may be out of concern.
Mm-hmm.
It may not come across as such, but maybe they are worried about how it may affect your life or your relationships or the response that you may have to others. And if you frame your story in such a way that it still emphasizes, I'm happy, I'm healthy, I have all of this going for me, in a way that shows your strengths, that you're still the same person that they know and that they love and respect and what have you, it can remedy some of those concerns as well. So I'd really urge you, if you're thinking about sharing your story to someone new, try to do so in a way that really focuses on your strengths, your own self-acceptance in your process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of trying to stay away from that poor me or the trying to, the pity party, right? But coming across as confident and this is part of who I am and I can still live a good life and do the things I want to do. So I think that's, and to add to that, I think especially with older generations, there is that negative stigma. Mental health in general, if you have a mental health issue, there's something really wrong with you, you're not going to have a normal life. But what we're finding out now with all this research and as people are coming out and promoting it and advocating, it's really not that way. And so it's going back to that educational piece and helping older generations understand that this isn't what everybody thought it was 50 years ago or 40 years, even 10 or 15 years ago. It's so different. So yeah, I think that's an important piece too.
Yeah, so you've seen a wave of more acceptance or change in public perception over the course of your life, which has gotten you to a place, it sounds like, where you're still passionate about advocating and broadcasting because you see the need, but it may feel safer to do so.
Right, absolutely.
That's great.
Absolutely. Like I said, at 16 years old, I never would have done that. And I think even knowing that it would help other people, because I didn't know anybody else with it at the time. Nobody really knew what it was. And so I think I would have been really scared about sharing that with it being so rare. It seemed rare at the time, right? But now the world is very much different, so it makes it easier.
Right, absolutely. Any last minute tips related to disclosure before we'll segue into some of the questions that you may have for us?
My tip is just you brought it up. What is your why? Why would you want to share your story? And pay attention to the timing. Don't feel bad if it's not the right timing. Pay attention to your why and the timing. If you feel good about it and you're ready to do it, do it. If you don't, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with you. There will be a time where you will want to share it, and you'll be ready when that time comes. So that's my piece of advice.
And my piece of advice is back to that weighing the pros and cons. Now, I am a geek in the sense that I make pro and cons lists for every trivial aspect of my life. Sometimes I rank order them, sometimes I color code them and whatnot. But when I was 16 and when I was in the darkness of some of my own mental health experiences, that was not true for me. And so taking that moment to pause, really think through what's best for me rather than what's best for Jake, what's best in terms of my family life rather than what's best at school perhaps, I think can be really powerful in helping you make a smart choice for you in that moment in time. That being said, I think we will field a couple questions, if that's all right.
Okay. Yeah. So
what else comes to mind for you?
I think one of the questions was, what is a good way, or what are the pros and cons, going back to this, of dealing with Tourette or any of these other things? Like, what are the pros and cons to that, and doing it healthy, or doing it in a healthy way?
And can you speak to that a bit?
Man,
given your lived experience.
I'm asking you. No, I'm just kidding.
I think you're the expert.
I know. No, I think what I've learned from that, and this is part of disclosure too, because is you share what I found is when I started sharing that I had Tourette syndrome, I didn't worry as much about the tics itself. So at church, at school, I've always sat in the back. I've always sat in the corners because I didn't want people seeing me. And once I did that, I didn't try to suppress it as much, and I didn't try to hold it in and fight it, because I realized, wow, people understand what I'm going through, so I don't have that judgment so much anymore, and if I do it, people understand why, and so it made it easier for me. And with Tourette syndrome in general, fighting it is worse than just letting it go. And so for me, a long time, even one of my tics is squeezing one of the nerves in my neck, and it used to be a bigger tic, but I've wanted to try to suppress it, so now it's just like one nerve in my neck, and it's super painful. But I've done that because I was worried about people seeing me. But now I've been able to kind of let it go a little bit more, because I don't feel the fear of the judgment as much. And so I think that's the healthy part of it, is just letting it go and just letting it do its thing, and then moving on from there. I don't know.
No, I've heard that from others, that sometimes the anxiety about what people will think can worsen tics, or it can be so much in your head that you can't engage with people in community to the extent that you might like. And so when getting to that point of being more upfront about it, it may take away some of that anxiety. That's absolutely a good insight. I think another question that we had, if I recollect, was regarding, am I normal? Am I normal to not be sharing my experiences? And I would say yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, a number of people hide or are avoidant or are kind of isolative, especially when early on in their diagnosis or before they even know what's going on, as a way of self-protection. And I will actually go on record as saying that as a form of secrecy almost, parents, don't listen to this, I think it is acceptable to tell white lies at times. So if you have a tic that sounds like a cough, do you have to tell someone it's because of Tourette? If you're fearful of someone's response or of a stigma, it can be an allergy. Yeah. That is just my personal perspective, but in terms of weighing your own pros and cons, do you think secrecy is acceptable in this environment? And if so, that may be an alternative.
That's a good point. I actually did that. I would do that. I had kind of a coughing thing in high school, and that was one of the things. My throat's dry, or allergies, or when I had the excessive blinking of my eyes are dry, I need to get eye drops. Yeah, for a while that's what I had to do, until I was ready to actually say, this is actually what I'm dealing with. It's very different. And I think, like you said, with the fact, am I normal for not wanting to share this yet? You brought up the point earlier about vulnerability, and vulnerability is hard for any human being to open up to. It can be a great power, but it can also, open you up to things that you weren't ready for and you may not ever want to experience in your life. And so, by being fearful of vulnerability, I would say that's completely normal. And again, going back to, once you're ready for it and the time comes and you know your why, then share it. But until then, it's totally fine, and you are okay for being you and okay for holding that in until that time comes.
Absolutely. I think Jake is a rare case of being an advocate and a social media advocate at that. The majority of people are really just trying to get through life as well and safely as they can, and are very selective in who they tell what to.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have one question for you guys. Is there a place that we can obtain resources or resource information to give to those who you choose to open up to?
Absolutely. So first, want to emphasize Tourette.org has an amazing resource list. Jake has also created some blogs and videos about his lived experience with Tourette that we can share with you in the show notes. And then one of our core programs, as I mentioned earlier, Up to Me, is a fabulous program helping people to make those choices related to disclosure, and recognizes that what is right for one person may not be right for others in their family. And so it helps you to develop a sort of empathy with each other, why you may want to tell someone and why your parents may not. And so we can also list that curriculum in the show notes to share with you, in addition to some of those other resources mentioned.
One more question. If applying for a job, when asked about disability accommodations as legally required for employers, would you recommend that I check the box saying that I don't have a disability? My Tourette's does not affect me in a way I would need any workplace accommodations.
That's interesting that you asked that. We had talked about that prior to this conversation. I will give you one perspective, then I'll ask that Jake give you his from his own lived experience. I would say if it does not affect you, there's no need to. There's no need for an accommodation. But if you would like to be more authentic and genuine and have your employer know because you're concerned that it may affect you down the road, then I would think carefully about that employer. What do you know about that employer that may suggest to you that they would be accepting and accommodating of it? But if you're fearful that it may preclude you from gaining employment, I would hold off until you learn more about that particular employer or boss or supervisor. And it may not be such that you have to tell the entire organization. It may be that you tell that one person that you work with who manages your schedule, or who down the line might help you to gain those accommodations that you may come to need. Jake?
I actually agree with that 100%. Early on in my college years, I worked at a restaurant as a server, and that was a job I was like, I should probably tell them I have Tourette syndrome, because if I'm carrying these big platters of food around and something happens and I drop it, they need to know, that I probably should avoid carrying these big platters. So that was something I let them know, but in a majority of the other positions I've had, I just didn't need to tell them, because you're right, it didn't necessarily affect my role in what I was doing. So I love that. I agree with you.
And so it sounds like, once again, based on your reason, if it's necessary in terms of doing that job well to the best of your ability, or you need accommodations to do so, that's the point at which it would constitute a disability for the sake of that career.
Absolutely. Great question. But anything else you want to add? I think we gave our main points here on what we want people to take away. But
I would second that. Thank you all for joining in and for listening to us today.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.